Parallel Wireless, which is one of the Open RAN software players. And one of the things that their boss, Steve Papp, has been pushing for are, better radios, basically, more capable radios. And he specifically called out the energy efficiency. He said this is one of the reasons why Huawei's been winning the race, is this, the fact that they just have smaller and more lightweight radios. So it's really, really important. Now, the thing that slightly upset is really funny in a way, that 2 days later in Shanghai, where Mobile World Congress is going on this week, Huawei comes out with an update for a new radio unit, a successor to its 25 kilogram one. And guess how much it weighs? 19 kilograms. So they basically...
One less.
It's almost like they've got wind of what Ericsson's up to and thought, let's just put in a bit of extra effort.
It's easy to suspect that, isn't it?
Yeah, let's put in just a little bit of extra effort just to upset the party, and then we can sort of regain
put it on
the
a
title
diet, get
of
it to sort of do a bit of Rocky running with a tracksuit on, sweat off that extra kilo. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. It's quite a sunny day here in late February, UK. So, we're all looking forward to drinking outside.
Bloody freezing, though.
It is cold. I think I'm going to order some Long Johns or something. Get a full outside drinking kit, because we're going to have about a month where pubs are allowed to serve us outside but not inside.
You want cushioned ones for the park benches, so that you're not sort of freezing your arse off when you're drinking your tenants.
But if you're going to be drinking pints, you need a sort of easy access Long Johns as well. Can't be complicated that process too much, can you? Cool. All right, we're cracking on fairly sharpish because Pierre's got grown upness to do in about an hour or so. So I'm going to look at what we're going to talk about. We're going to start by talking about mid-band 5G. In other words, the spectrum it's called mid-band, around 3.5 gigahertz or so, and why we care about it, and is it worth all the hassle? And then we're going to move on to a bit of US politics as it overlaps with telecoms. There's a couple of stories I wrote about, one sort of giving us a sense of whether Biden's going to carry on where Trump left off, and another about them trying to get US carriers to censor people they don't like, which I think is quite juicy. Then we're going to finish off by having a little look at patents. Ian, you did one of your deep dive analytical bits, having a look at the patent situation, and we'll see what conclusions you came to on that. Just to remind you, if you're watching this on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. And before we crack into it, I think producer Pierre wants to tell us who's been listening to the podcast. Hit it, Pierre.
Correct. Yes. So the city of the month is Sydney, Australia. Thank you. From Dananda.
That's like for the whole month, is it? The most listened location. Well, I don't think I'm going to try and do a stupid Australian accent. If only.
No, you have to do Ray Winston again.
No, that's China.
Oh.
Perhaps Australians can be French. Thank you very much. You suss it as is.
That's good.
There we go. Okay, so that's quite enough of that. Right, mid-band. So yes, like I said, it's about 3.5 gigahertz. So traditionally, the radio waves that are used for mobile sort of started at about, 800 megahertz, and went up to about 2 gig, roughly. Perhaps a bit over that. But the useful ones
2 gig's about right for the 3G stuff. It was in 2.1, I think, most of it in Europe. Anyway.
Okay, cool. Okay, so useful, between, let's say, 1 and 2 gig area, and the lower the frequency, the better the range and the propagation. It just goes further from the radio tower and penetrates things like walls better. Mm-hmm. So we went up to about 2 gig or so. But the only thing about that frequency is there's not that much of it because it's so good. Lots of people want to use it, military, broadcast, whatever, whoever needs wireless. And there's only so much of that real estate available. And with 5G, I mean, it's not a technology unique to 5G. Things like carrier aggregation, massive MIMO, they're not unique to 5G, to the best of my knowledge. But it basically means having lots of parallel streams. So typically, like the smallest chunk of spectrum that you use for radio signals is about 5 megahertz. Is that right?
Yeah, it's usually 5 megahertz slots that it
Sort of
gets
each
awarded
way.
in. Yeah.
Each way if you're doing a FTD.
Yeah. You're going to have to explain what Ftd and Tdd is
right,
now, Scott.
I
That's
know.
a whole
I've
other
realised, even
tangent.
though I've been a telecoms journalist for 7 years, I still feel like I'm getting out of my depth with this stuff. So you butt in any time you want.
No, well, don't ask me. I mean,
okay.
It's starting to get quite
FTD
technical.
is frequency division duplexing. Is that right?
Yeah.
Duplexing meaning upstream and downstream, i.e. sending the signal and receiving a signal. Frequency division means that you get, let's say, for example, a 10 megahertz chunk of spectrum, and you cut it in half, and one half does one direction, one half does the other direction.
Yeah.
And then TDD is time division
duplexing.
Duplexing, which basically means you use the whole, let's say, 10 megahertz, and things just sort of take it in turns.
Yeah. It's like the difference between a single lane with traffic lights and a sort of road with two lanes in either direction.
Yeah. So we get a twice as big a lane, but cars have to take it in turns to go one way or the other.
Yeah.
To stretch the metaphor, perhaps. Anyway, and what you can do, and there's only so much. If people always use the analogy of a pipe, as in a water pipe. And there's only so much water you can get through a water pipe of 1 centimeter diameter. And you can get a 2 centimeter diameter, could probably get a 2 times pi amount of water more through, and so on. And the same, for the purpose of sort of metaphor, applies to frequency, doesn't it? More frequency equals fatter pipe equals better throughput. And for us to get these super duper sort of 1 gigabit per second plus download speeds that we're expecting from 5G, we basically have to get a lot more spectrum involved, which is why we have to move up to the higher frequencies. I'm just wondering, like, I got during the week, I got an analyst, Dean Bubley, who will have forgotten more than I've ever known about this stuff, sort of pinging me on Twitter to say he's listening, and just wondering if he's listening to my explanation of this stuff and wincing. If you are, Dean, feel free to cuss me on Twitter. I don't mind. So that's why we have to move up the frequency stack, not because there's anything intrinsically better about that frequency, about midband. There's just more of it, and you could get 50, 100 megahertz all pointing one direction, creating this fat pipe. So that sort of meandering way is leading up to Ericsson announcement, which was one of the bigger product announcements this week. They've come up with a new suite of products designed specifically to make the most out of mid-band. And one of the reasons you need special products for that is because the propagation characteristics aren't so good and because the range isn't so good, there are special clever technologies you can use, such as massive MIMO that I've already mentioned, but also beamforming, which is a way of sort of actively targeting it at devices, to the best of my knowledge. Again, I'm just waiting for you to laugh in my face and correct me at any stage here, Ian.
No, that's right. It's like a flashlight rather than a floodlight, I suppose.
There we go. Cool. Nice analogy. And so that's why you need extra kit. And one of Ericsson's big claims, and in a sec I'll hand over to you, Ian, because you can talk about some of the others, is that it basically does that stuff better. There was one set for urban, one set for suburban, one set for rural settings. We normally haven't, for example, associated even mid-band, let alone microwave, with rural settings because of the range issues. But if you can be clever enough with things like beamforming, it looks like you can use it in a rural setting. So that was one of their claims of it. But there were some other sort of unique features, which I'll get you to expand on, because you've also got some sort of competitive contrast to talk about there.
Yeah. So I mean, I took note of all the things you've talked about, and then something else that stuck out for me, which I sort of led my coverage with was the weight of this unit they've come out with. And it sounds like that might be a bit of a boring issue to talk about how heavy and how big your radio units are, but apparently it's really critical. I've talked to people about this before, and one of the reasons it's important is, obviously if you're lugging around really heavy boxes and really heavy bits of gear, then it just requires more effort basically for technicians. and it's harder to put them into places. They're trying to put sort of these radio units in all sorts of nooks and crannies these days on buildings, so they become harder to install. So there's obviously a cost saving. If you can make it easier to do things like that, there's a cost saving, and there's more options available to you if it's easier to put it into some of these nooks and crannies.
Yeah, and they're going to have to look for more nooks and crannies with.
They're going to have to. They are, yeah.
Because of the shorter range, they've got to dot more of them around the place, haven't they?
Exactly. And then the other thing is energy efficiency. So there's kind of a direct correlation between the size of your unit and how energy efficient they tend to be. And part of that's just due to the fact that the big units, when they heat up, they're just harder to cool down. You basically need more passive cooling equipment to do that. You need more, if you've got heavier units on towers, there's other costs that go with that. So they're basically just not as energy efficient the bigger they get. And one of the big sort of shout outs that Ericsson made in its press release was about the energy efficiency being something like 20-25% greater. But the thing that the really interesting to me is the weight it's in. If you're just trying to look at that, the weight as a metric and judge vendors on that basis. Before it came out with this update this week, I think Ericsson had a radio unit, the same kind of thing, massive MIMO, very advanced 64T, 64R, all that sort of stuff. All these transmitters and receivers in it, and it was, I think, about 37 kilograms, the last generation one. And they've got it down in this one to 20 kilograms. Now, it's almost half. So all these benefits I've been talking about to do with energy efficiency and how much easier to install, that's going to make quite a big difference there. But the other thing, just from a pure sort of competition in the market perspective, when we talk about how good Huawei is at making mobile equipment, you go out to talk to analysts about this, and they're one of the market leaders, and we've had all these stories over the last few years about an 18-month lead that they have in some areas, and they're much better at doing some things. I remember digging into this a while ago, and one of the key things that they've done very, very well is lightweight stuff. So their last this time last year, actually, they were kind of shouting a lot about a unit very similar to the one that Ericsson's just announced that weighed 25 kilograms. And at the time, Ericsson's equivalent is, 36, 37. It's quite a big weight differential there, 11, 12 kilograms. And I remember talking to some semiconductor experts who, a lot of this is to do with the semiconductor innovation is one of the reasons they've been able to make these units smaller and smaller. And he was saying that this is why they've, high silicon, Huawei's internal chip business is just really good at doing this stuff. And it's one of the things that kind of keeps them ahead of Ericsson and Nokia. So Ericsson coming out with this week with this 20 kilogram unit, 5 kilograms less than the one that Huawei has been marketing, is, it's basically it's a real coup for Ericsson. And I remember talking to them on the call, and she was the lady I talked to, whose name I'm embarrassingly going to forget now, but you've probably got it written down somewhere.
I've probably got it on my pad here. Yeah.
But she was
Sybil, something like
Sybil,
that.
yeah, Sybil, I think is her first name. But Tombaz, Sybil Tombaz.
Sybil Tombaz, yeah. Not to be confused with Sybil Faulty.
But she was saying, she made a really big deal of this because I pressed her a bit, and she said, well, this is a new benchmark for the industry. As far as we're aware, this is the industry benchmark now. It's now the lightest weight radio unit you can get in that particular category. Massive MIMO, 64T, 64R. This is the lightest thing you can get. Which is huge, for Ericsson to be able to say, after years and years of being perceived to be lagging Huawei in one of these critical areas, that they can say they have a better unit than Huawei on this.
And the underlying impression is of a direction of travel that has Ericsson catching up and
it's
over
huge.
things.
It's really important because energy costs, by the way, the thing I didn't mention, energy costs for operators are about 5% of their total OPEX. So it's big. It's a big cost. It's much more significant than a lot of other stuff. And it's actually higher at some operators, they think. I think McKinsey was saying up to 10% at some players. So you can get that figure down. It's a huge difference. And this is one of the reasons you talk to people like Parallel Wireless, which is one of the Open RAN software players. And one of the things that their boss, Steve Papper's been pushing for are, better radios, basically, more capable radios. And he specifically called out the energy efficiency. He said this is one of the reasons why Huawei's been winning the race, is this, the fact that they just have smaller and more lightweight radios. So it's really, really important. Now, the thing that slightly upset, it's really funny in a way, that 2 days later in Shanghai, where Mobile World Congress is going on this week, Huawei comes out with an update, for a new radio unit, a successor to its 25 kilogram one. And guess how much it weighs? 19 kilograms. So they basically
one less.
It's almost like they've got wind of what Ericsson's up to and thought, let's just put in a bit of extra effort.
It's easy to suspect that, isn't it?
Yeah, let's put in just a little bit of extra effort just to upset the party, and then we can sort of regain
put it on
the
a
title
diet, get it to sort of do a bit of Rocky running with a tracksuit on, sweat off that extra kilo.
So basically, Ericsson had an industry benchmark for about 3 days. And now they're number 2 again. But I mean, joking aside, I think the important thing is, you look at the differential between the two companies before, it was 11, 12 kilograms, as I said. And it's now, the kilograms not really going to make a lot of difference. Let's call it even. I mean, I sort of slightly made fun of it in the second story I wrote that they'd sort of lost the title after only 3 days.
I bet Ericsson loved that. I bet Sybil was really happy with you then.
But I did say that the important thing is it shows how much more competitive they are now compared to what they were, and I think, again, we talk a lot about the success of the new strategy under Ekholm. A lot of it's been to do with selling non-core assets and putting more fund. I mean, I had another look at their research and development spending actually when I wrote the story, and I think it's gone up from about 3.8 billion a year in 2016, which is the year before Ekholm took charge, when they had lots and lots of diverse businesses, by the way. They had a much bigger media. It's gone up by $1 billion. It's 4.8 billion last year on R&D. So it's an extra $1 billion. And obviously it's mainly going now towards, it's a much more focused business, basically.
And as you say, that was Ekholm's plan from the start. It's like, look, if we can't free up some cash to make sure we're at least keeping up with the rest. And that especially means Huawei in R&D, then we might as well just throw in the towel.
They're up there. They're there's nobody else anyway. It's only those two really, I think, on this in this particular area. So it's a bit of a 2-horse race, but it's great. It's fascinating that they've made that big an improvement. And you talked to the same lady, Sybil Tombaz was saying that it's she called out the work that Ericsson Silicon, which is their kind of high silicon equivalent, has been doing as a kind of big differentiator here. It's the kind of breakthroughs they've made that have allowed this to happen. So
it's ironic, isn't it? We've spoken lots of times about Nokia and their missteps. And I remember hearing Nokia bang on about their own silicon before I ever heard Huawei or Ericsson go on about theirs.
Yeah.
And yet it's now their silicon efforts that have kind of blown it all.
Well, I did try to get something out of Nokia on this because you obviously want to find out what they're sort of saying about their radio units as well at the same time if you're comparing them, and they spoke to me and didn't sort of provide an update. Now I know they're sort of in recovery mode. I mean, they'd admit that themselves. They're putting more research and they're kind of copying Ericsson in a way in terms of upping the amount going into 5G, and they're getting on top of this problem, but they are perceived to be a bit behind the other two, I think, at the moment. And that's something I think that everybody would recognise. It's just a case of what they can do to turn that around this year.
It'd be interesting to see whether Inmarsat suddenly gets into the FPGA game. Because the new CEO, the new CEO of Inmarsat is one Rajiv Suri, who was the CEO of Nokia, who oversaw their miscalculation on the silicon side. So
I don't know how much we can blame him for it.
No, not directly.
He was the man in charge. You do carry the can, I suppose. So he was the man there when their sort of 5G fall from grace happened, I guess. So
there's just no escaping it.
Yeah.
Okay. So So do you reckon that's sort of? Do you think that's quite a big blow for Ericsson, Nokia being able to sort of match them straight away, or is it quite a cosmetic thing?
Huawei.
Sorry,
I think
Huawei.
I mean, look, as I say, there was quite a big difference between the two of them. These are numbers out from the companies themselves, really, that I've checked. 36 kilograms down to 20, and Huawei's gone down from 25 to 19. So as we say, they're basically on a par at the moment, and there was a big gap before. And if it's as important as they say it is, and it's as important as third parties like Parallel Wireless are saying it is, and these energy costs are as significant as they are, then this is obviously a reason why, if you're looking at different radio units and different vendors and measuring them up against one another, then, that's a very compelling reason in the past to have bought Huawei equipment rather than Ericsson equipment, I would have thought. So, whereas now you're looking at it,
so at least they've taken that USP
there
away
isn't
from
really there isn't a compelling reason. And I think with the other, I mean, the two interesting things are that it shows how competitive the two firms are against one another now when they perhaps weren't before. I think we could say that Huawei's perhaps a bit ahead in this area, which I think sort of indicates what Ecom's been doing. And the other thing is, it shows that Huawei is not going anywhere, doesn't it, at the moment? I mean, we keep talking about its difficulties. The US has been doing what it can to sort of gum up its supply chains and everything and make things awkward for it there. And as I understand it, it does rely on a lot of these components that it's getting from people like TSMC for base station and sort of mobile equipment.
Well, I was going to say, it's all very well then talking about their great silicon, but if they can't get anyone to manufacture it.
This is the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's not going to affect what HiSilicon does. It's not going to affect their design expertise. But if they can't get the manufacturing done at companies that also have very sort of state-of-the-art processes, then does that upset them later this year or next year?
We'll come back to that on the US politics stuff as well.
That's the thing we don't really know yet, because it's just a bit hard to get. It's a bit hard to get anything from them actually on that particular issue. I mean, they've sort of talked quite a lot about the phone stuff, haven't they? The smartphone problems, but they keep insisting that when it comes to the network side of things, they haven't really had any problems. And maybe they've just stockpiled a lot of stuff. I don't know what the reason would be, but as I say, from what analysts have said to me, it's an issue for the network side of things as well as the phones. These US sanctions.
It'd be interesting to see whether it's an extra issue outside of China, because I would imagine, whatever's going on with the support that Huawei is presumably getting from the Chinese government, and that's notwithstanding, that's not even to second guess the allegations about how cozy they were prior to this. But I'm sure the CCP, with all the shit Huawei's been having to put up with from the Americans, has been stepping in to help it out. But presumably one condition of that is that if stocks are dwindling, you prioritize China over the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So I would expect if they do start to have supply problems for their networking gear, it will manifest itself ex-China first.
Yeah, you'd think so. And I mean, they've built a hell of a lot of stuff in China as well. This is the thing. So, it's they'd what is it, 700,000 base stations last year, most of those going to Huawei and ZTE. So, it's not as if they haven't been rolling out heavily. So, yeah, it does make you wonder what's happening on that side. But I mean, we'll have to have a look in there. They haven't actually come out with their annual report yet, have they, for 2020? Unless I'm
Huawei.
Yeah.
Well, they don't really. I mean, they're very selective about what they publish, because they
are selective about what they publish.
Anything.
But they did when that's true. But also when their 2019 one came out, I remember it did show quite a big increase in the amount they've been spending on components. Okay. And be sort of interesting to see that number in the 2020 report.
I just don't know. No offense, Huawei. I just don't know how seriously to take public numbers when there doesn't seem to be much auditing, when they're not a public company.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they outright lie, but there's much less disincentive for them to massage the numbers to suit whatever narrative they want to tell than a fully transparent Western public company.
That's true. Yeah.
So, I just tend to take it with a pinch of salt. It's all Huawei says.
It is, but I can sort of believe the top line stuff that they're putting out.
Yeah, as you say, they couldn't just claim stuff.
No, and it just it seems plausible just because of things that we've talked about in recent weeks. Like the Chinese 5G rollout, the fact that it's so big, and that is obviously most of the most network spending goes into that radio area. So. When you've got a country building close to 1 million base stations in a year, then that's obviously going to have a big impact on your figures. And if that hadn't happened, then we probably, when we looked at the numbers and they were saying we still grew last year, we'd be sort of scratching our heads and going, well, how? Because your smartphone shares down quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I think it's plausible.
Okay. And as you say, the numbers, however skeptically we read them, will still make interesting reading.
Yeah.
And so mid-band. So we've got all this innovation going on in mid-band, and it's as we're going to come to in a sec, most of the 5G auctions, spectrum auctions, have concerned mid-band. But before we get into the latest US C-band auction, which concluded this week, or at least they published the results this week, just thought I'd ask your opinion on the importance of mid-band, because the impression I get is that 5G, certainly on the enhanced mobile broadband, is that what we call it?
Yeah.
I.e. the bigger, the fatter pipe side, it basically doesn't happen at all without mid-band. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think mid-band is where all the action is, to be honest, and I'm not even sure just for EMBB. I think just the whole shebang, really. I think your two other options, as you talked about earlier, are very sort of low frequency stuff, sub 1 gigahertz, which is really, really useful for rural coverage, wide area network coverage and this sort of thing. And it usually attracts very big fees as well, that sub 1 gigahertz stuff, because you can build out a network with fewer base stations and cover big areas outside cities, and you need that sort of underlying coverage
and tick all the regulatory
boxes, provide with maybe not with 5G, but with older services, obviously just provide the sort of basic voice connectivity and sort of messaging platforms that people want. And you'll need that with 5G as well. You'll need the low band side of things there as well. But you can't, as you say, the problem with that stuff is you can't get these more advanced, higher speed services because there just isn't enough spectrum. Basically, you look at the different bands and there's a lot less available. You go up the sort of the gigahertz scale or whatever, and more opens up.
And then you got tons at millimeter wave. There was a very good.
Well, that's the other side of it. The millimeter wave, the 26 gigahertz, everything, and that was in the US in particular. There was a lot of excitement about this area, driven, I think, by Verizon and some of it, it's sort of hype machine about how great millimeter wave was. And I remember them being at conferences before saying, "Oh, all the action's at millimeter wave. 5G is very much a millimeter wave story." Rubbish. It clearly isn't, because you just can't get decent coverage. And
there's just lots of it. I mean, there was a story I wrote 6 months, a year ago, something like that. It was on the US, and it was someone like OpenSignal had done a study on coverage and capacity, 5G coverage and capacity among the four MNOs in the States, and they found that T-Mobile has got brilliant coverage, but the speeds are barely higher than 4G. And contrastingly, Verizon has got incredibly fast speeds and hardly any coverage. And there was no mystery to it. T-Mobile was mainly using something like 600 megahertz spectrum for its supposed 5G.
Yeah.
And Verizon has got a ton of millimeter wave. So I've got to give a shout out. I mean, Mary for Telecoms.com did a great story on it, but an extra shout out to Mike Dano from Light Reading. And I'm looking at a piece he wrote that's got lots of really useful charts in it.
Yeah.
And the final chart he's got on that is something called propagation distance. And I think this is on a relative scale with 700 megahertz just as an arbitrary one. And then everything higher than that relative to it. And it's basically sort of directly proportional, or I suppose you could say inversely proportional. The higher the frequency, the lower the propagation distance. So if 700 megahertz is 1, 850, you're already down to 0.83. So that's 83% of the coverage. Once you get to 2 gigahertz, you're at 0.36, 2.5, 0.28. 3.5 gigahertz, which is what mid-band is, you're at 0.09. So you're basically 10% of the propagation distance of 700 megahertz. And then millimeter wave is 0.003. So that's 0.3%.
Well, it's just useless, isn't it? I think it was Verizon hype, and I think even Verizon now it has recognised, hasn't it? Because we're going to talk about this, but the amount of money that it's spent in this recent mid-band auction shows that the future isn't millimeter wave. Millimeter wave might be useful in particular scenarios, but it's the other interesting thing is actually outside the US and particularly outside Verizon, very few other operators internationally that I'm aware of have been making a fuss about millimeter wave. I think there's been a bit of talk about it maybe in South Korea, but I don't remember none of the UK operators. Now, 3 UK, as far as I'm aware, has quite a bit of it. And yet they don't make a big fuss about it. And there's not a lot of talk. There's not a lot of sort of push from the other MNOs in the UK market on this. I just think people realise a lot of people realise it's not very useful.
I think
mean,
maybe
if you're in a hotspot
useful
in a city centre, you could use something else. You could use fibre or through a Wi-Fi connection to get really
maybe
fast
it's good
speeds.
maybe it'll be good for like smart factories or something like that, where you just got a great big throbbing base station on the roof of the factory, and that's powering all the clever robots and stuff.
Yeah, although the spectrum that's being auctioned in some countries for directly to enterprises, the stuff that German companies are buying, some German car makers and so on, is not. I don't think it's those bands, is it? I mean, I might be mistaken on that,
right.
but I think that's also
I can't remember.
That's also
exactly
mid-band. So they had mid-band spectrum in Germany carved out, a tranche of it for industrial groups, non-telcos to use. And it's not millimeter wave. It's it's the 3.5, 3.6 stuff as well.
Yeah.
So
that's what this C band is. I can't remember precisely what the frequency of C band is, but it's in that area, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's around 3.7.
3.7.
There we are. 3.7. Yeah.
And anyway, and Verizon dropped the most cash, and it shelled out $45.5 billion.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of money, even for a massive company and a massive country. And another chart that Mike put in his story. So I know that for the European spectrum auctions, you keep your own Excel where you calculate the price per megahertz per head of population. And that's as good a metric as any for working out the relative value that people have got from an auction, and it varies quite a lot because auctions can just go crazy, can't they? Perhaps they do one auction last thing on a Friday and everyone's half cut, and they're just like, yeah, fuck it, I'll go again. And anyway, so I know you've said it's a bit more complicated to do this calculation for the US because it's regionalized and there's other sort of complicating factors, but this other source, New Street Research, who clearly just put more effort in than you do, mate.
Evidently.
They've got some numbers on megahertz, price per megahertz per population. Why don't you just give us some sense of how that compares with Europe from your knowledge of the matter?
Yeah, I mean, you pointed me in the direction of those numbers that they put together because I hadn't seen the detail of Mike's story.
You don't even read your own colleagues' stuff.
No, I do,
Shocking.
but I mean, what are we're talking about a sort of dollar, aren't we? Around about the dollar mark, I think, which is, and I had to sort of refresh my mind on what happened in Europe. So, I mean, just looking at the Excel spreadsheet, the currency conversions aren't completely up to date, but they're not very old. And Italy was the big spender in Europe in the mid-band. I mean, it was everybody was saying how outrageous it was actually that auction raised as much as it did and the operators spent so heavily. And the spending there was $43 cents per megahertz pop.
And these guys average 95 cents among them all.
Exactly. I mean, you go to Germany, which is the next highest one in Europe out of the ones I've looked at. And well, it would be the next highest one because I've pretty much covered most of them. But they're on 0.20, so $20 cents. And then France 16, the UK 16, going right down to sort of four in Finland, 6 in Ireland. It's pretty low in a lot of cases. But Italy was the big outlier, followed by Germany in Europe, and they've spent way less than has been spent in the US.
So have you got any idea why the Americans are shelling out so much more?
Well, Mike did a really interesting story actually on called High Rollers. Look at auction strategy and the structure, the way the auction works. I mean, they're all a bit odd, aren't they, in terms of how much you know about what other bidders are doing.
Yes.
And it seems they in this case they weren't very aware of what was going on, and they were
There's some quite blind bidding, isn't there?
There was a lot of blind bidding, and I mean that's obviously going to push up the prices. But I think
I know you're just going to get paranoid.
I don't think it was completely unexpected. There's a really interesting quote from T-Mobile's boss, Mike Sievert, is it? I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name.
Sounds about right.
He'd said in advance of this that he reckoned what was going to happen was there was going to be a bidding frenzy, and that AT&T and Verizon were going to end up shelling out tens of billions on this stuff. And he was bang on the money, wasn't he? I mean, 45 billion for Verizon. I don't know what AT&T was, but theirs was also high, wasn't it? I think you've probably got the number there in front of you somewhere. But,
yeah. So we've got. It's interesting actually. This table has got different numbers I think maybe there's clearing costs.
But
So 45. So if we take out clearing costs, there's 45 by Verizon, 23 by AT&T,
yeah,
9. This is rounded down, by the way. 9 by T-Mobile,
yeah, and
which obviously includes Sprint now.
I just think that they couldn't not bid for it. Basically, not getting this spectrum is like a sort of end of days thing, really.
Yeah,
and it shows how important mid-band is. It just reinforces the point about how important this spectrum is, and it proves that Verizon was completely wrong. The people who got up in conferences and said it's all about millimeter wave, and then they come into an auction and spend $45 billion on mid-band spectrum.
What happened to that millimeter wave, eh?
I mean, it shows how desperate they were. And I think the thing is that these companies, AT&T and Verizon, knew if they didn't get this spectrum, T-Mobile was going to kill them. And the reason T-Mobile spending is so much less, I mean, you were just talking then about T-Mobile having all this 600 megahertz stuff, a few years ago that they were going on about. Well, they don't anymore, do they? Because they bought Sprint. And one of the main reasons for that acquisition was Sprint's mid-band spectrum.
Right.
It's 2.5, isn't it, that it's in? So it's in that sweet spot, basically.
Which is even better, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much difference it makes when you between sort of 2.5, 3.5. I've talked to European operators about their 3G band, which is 2.1, and then being able to use 3.5 in the same grid, and they seem to think they can. And
but judging by that diagram, that diagram that's from Moffat Nathanson that Mike put in his thing, if we just take these sort of metrics, these indices, literally, 2.5 gigahertz is at 0.28. And 3.5 is at 0.09. So that implies that 3.5 has a quarter of the range of 2.5.
Yeah, but I think some of that going back to our little Ericsson discussion and beamforming and stuff like that, I think some of that can be overcome with beamforming and some of these other advanced technologies that you've got now. So France's Orange, for instance, doesn't expect to densify its network very much at all when it builds 5G on mid-band. And the reason for that, I think, is that they think they can take advantage of things like beamforming to make up that difference, if you like. But if you're going, you're talking about the gap that Verizon had, where it's at 26 gigahertz or whatever it was with its millimeter wave. I mean, in that case, obviously, you can't just put that on the same grid as your kind of low band stuff. You're going to have to sort of build thousands and thousands and thousands of base stations, which they're not going to do. So they knew that if they didn't get this mid-band stuff, they were going to get crucified in the market by T-Mobile. And they're already getting crucified anyway. Those companies are losing badly to T-Mobile at the moment. So this is like...
Right. Yeah, well, there's one more chart, and then I better move it on because we're time constrained a bit this week. There's one more chart on Mike's piece that seems to illustrate your point really well, which is like a sort of before and after, where it's just a bar graph showing sub 6 gigahertz spectrum holdings. And, in mid-band... mid and mid/high band, T-Mobile had absolutely tons. Everything prior to this, it had 300 megahertz of spectrum, whereas Verizon had like half that, and AT&T not a lot more. So in just terms of pure spectrum real estate, in low and mid band, T-Mobile was well ahead of the other two. And even after shelling out all this cash, Verizon still doesn't have as much spectrum as T-Mobile does.
Yeah.
It's got up to about the level it was before the auction, but T-Mobile bought a bit as well.
It's got a much bigger balance sheet problem, though, now. One of the other interesting details is Wednesday, I think, this week, Verizon announced a $25 billion loan from JP Morgan Chase Bank.
Right.
And its share price went down from about 50. I've got it here. It's 57.35 to 56.28 on the news of that. So they're having it's a huge load that they're spending on this, isn't it? And then they've got
AT&T's obviously got massive debt because of Time Warner and all that.
Yeah, and this explains, I think. I mean, this is really going to constrain these companies. This is the worry, is what this means for them. Everybody talked about the European 3G auctions and what that meant for sort of investments afterwards. And the operators often go on about, well, we couldn't spend as much money on network rollout because so much had gone into spectrum. I think the same questions are going to get asked now about happens in the US. And they weren't in a super position anyway. As you say, AT&T in particular is into a cost-cutting program, and they're both, AT&T and Verizon are both sort of shedding staff, thousands and thousands of employees each year, is one way of trying to reduce costs. So none of this is very encouraging, I don't think, really, in terms of what it means for the next few years and on the cost side of things.
Yeah, and actually sort of staying in the US, I mean, so obviously the beneficiaries of all this money that Verizon, AT&T has shelled out is the UK, the US government. Presumably it just goes into the pot. The US government's had to borrow about $10 zillion just to fund the lockdown and all that stuff, but presumably this won't do any harm. But there were a couple of stories that I thought were interesting this week regarding the US government and how it affects the telecoms sector. The first is, this sort of follows on, I mentioned last week that Wei did this great in-depth analysis of, we had a hell of a lot to write about while Trump was president because he kept dicking about with telecoms, especially Huawei. And so we're, as telecoms journalists, we're kind of shitting ourselves a bit that Biden's going to be boring and not give us anything to write about. Well, it looks like we don't need to worry because he's come straight out. He did a few executive orders about domestic stuff, but his first that I'm aware of sort of major executive order, because they don't bother debating laws anymore. They just pass them unilaterally. He calls it the Executive Order on America's Supply Chains. And it opens by stating the United States needs resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains to ensure our economic prosperity and national security. Now, what I think, so a lot of this is to do with semiconductors, which we've spoken about before. The whole global semiconductor scenario has been kind of screwed up by Trump's unilateral action in stopping Huawei and China in general getting hold of chips from the likes of TSMC. There've also been action against SMIC, the biggest Chinese fab. And that's led to stockpiling, which in turn has led to a shortage. And now Detroit, America's car makers can't get hold of chips, and cars are all full of chips these days. So no chips equals no cars equals nightmare for American president. So Biden's acting on it. But that's where I thought the economic prosperity part of that opening statement was interesting. National security is following on sort of directly from the Trump policy of not letting, of sort of trying to isolate China and not letting them get hold of US technology and all that sort of thing. But now they've identified things like rare earth minerals, which are all these obscure heavy metals down at the bottom of the periodic table that you need for things like semiconductors, that you need for things like batteries, all sorts of stuff.
Gallium nitride, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the names of them, but it's all these ones at the bottom of the periodic table that you never had to give a shit about. Even lower down than like gold and stuff. Basically, on the way to the sort of Einsteinium half-life of 2 nanosecond pointless elements, we've got these obscure heavy metals that are quite handy for stuff. You don't need much of them, but you do need them. They probably act as sort of chemical catalysts as well. And most of that stuff is dug up by China. And this has been known for decades. And everyone's just like, fair enough, China's good for that sort of thing. They'll just send some lads down a mine and they won't care about health and safety, bring this stuff up on the cheap, and everyone's a winner. But now that we've all decided that China's too dodgy to do business with, people at America are shitting themselves over securing their supply chains of these things. So that's the sort of national security reason for this. But the talk of economic prosperity is pure sort of MAGA, as in Make America Great Again, the Trump mantra that is supposed to be so toxic to his political opponents. It's a pure sort of MAGA play. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to totally agree with you. I think you'd already said stuff about this, actually, about very similar messages to Trump about protecting American jobs and stuff a few weeks ago. I can't remember exactly what it was on, what he was alluding to specifically in terms of the economic sector that he was on about. But it was the same sort of messages, just coming from Biden instead of Trump, and probably delivered in a different way. And,
well, exactly. That's exactly what I said. Sorry,
no one gets worked up about it in the same way, do they? I mean, I remember as soon as Trump started saying all this stuff, it was oh, it's protectionism. He doesn't give a damn about anybody else. It's very interesting that Biden's pretty much kind of carried on with the same
it's
messaging.
Hilarious.
But,
it's hilarious how superficial the analysis of
I
this
think
stuff is.
you mentioned Huawei. We still don't really know what his Huawei strategy is at the moment. I think in terms of how to deal with that company.
No, and he didn't even explicitly state China in any of this, by the way.
No, and also things like what happens to Huawei on the entity list. I mean, I know they've said they don't expect to come off it, but maybe they are just saying that anyway to sort of raise the issue and put it there in front of reporters so there's discussion about it. But it's I certainly, and I don't think a lot of people are expecting there to be a huge change. It's not like Huawei's going to be it's all right again. They can carry on serving European
markets. Well, this seems to be confirmation of that. Any doubt, it's going to be more of the same. As you say, it's served up by a less abrasive messenger, but it's pretty much the same stuff.
It wasn't just the abrasion; it was the very fact of it. I mean, I remember when he first came in, Donald Trump, and a lot of this anti-ZTE. I think ZTE was the first target, wasn't it? Really, and and then they sort of went after Meng, and there was a lot of these protectionist comments about jobs in America, and people were very, very critical about his attitude towards China and seemed to think it was unhelpful and wasn't going to. And yet Biden's, he's doing really the same thing, and yet we don't hear any sort of outcry in.
No,
I'm not aware of one anyway in the press about it in the same way. So
no, well, I'll get onto the double standards of how things are.
It is double standards,
in a sec. But I completely agree with what you said, and I've got one more quote from this executive order that just sums it up so well. Imagine you didn't know who had put an executive order with this quote in it. It says, resilient American supply chains will revitalize and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity, maintain America's competitive edge in research and development, and create well-paying jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's indistinguishable.
It's completely,
isn't it?
it is indistinguishable, yeah.
So
and also slightly, I mean, I remember Trump being criticised for thinking that you could possibly bring jobs back to America. In fact, I wrote a couple of things saying, well,
you can't just make them.
But just it sort of moved beyond that. It's not the jobs won't come back. They might come back to be done by machines. That's what might happen. You only have to look at Ericsson actually as an example of that, with its heavily robotized factory that it's got in Dallas now, where they've only got about 100 people, they're saying, that can serve the whole of the North American market with equipment. So, they're not. Other people were saying, jobs probably. I mean, the Economist writing a few articles on this. He's not going to be able to return jobs to America, and yet Biden talks about the same thing, and people don't scrutinize it in the same way.
Well, the thing about protectionism is you can create jobs, but you create expense. The reason we offshore jobs isn't just because we're sort of treasonous bastards. It's because we're basically importing deflation. We're importing wage deflation. We're in a globalized economy. We can see that a Chinese worker gets paid 10 cents an hour. An American worker gets paid $15 an hour. Well, I think I'll go with the Chinese worker. Thank you very much. And if it costs me a bit more in transport and logistics, that nowhere near eats away the difference. So you can bring stuff back to the US, and and the Democrats tend to be the ones who talk about higher minimum wage and all that sort of thing. By all means, create tons of American jobs. But that means you're going to be paying a higher wage, which means that the end product will be more expensive.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I'm not even saying I disagree with that, but let's look facts in the face. If you want to be protectionist, then you're telling your population they got to pay more for shit.
Yeah. Totally.
So that's that there. And then the other thing that's just so hilarious about the sort of public discourse in the States. And, this... Thankfully, there was a telecoms element, because this is more just me being self-indulgent and writing about stuff that intrigues me. But so the headline of this other story I wrote is FCC Democrats silent on calls for US cable providers to censor right-wing news. And basically 2 Democrat US representatives wrote to AT&T, Verizon, all these other cable providers, and basically said, look, you're carrying stuff like Fox News. They tell lies. What are you going to do about it? And the long and short of it is that these 2 Democrat members of the House of Congress now think that basically the people who own the pipes, or the people who provide the service, should act as censors and prevent access to content that they think sows, I think they use words like disinformation and misinformation, whatever the difference is. And God, they even use words like encourage
sounds like net
sedition
neutrality.
and stuff. You what?
Sounds almost like net neutrality.
Well, yeah, but brought to sort of TV. This is very much in the TV context.
Yeah.
And of course, the only channels they've identified as being dodgy are right-wing ones.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the most, as far as I'm concerned, and people like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, who are by no means conservatives, but are preeminent journalists, call it the same way. As far as I'm concerned, this is a very crude attempt at blanket partisan censorship by US politicians, Democrat politicians. And the reason there's a telecoms angle is that they're asking telecoms providers to do the censorship. It'd be like I don't know, it'd be like Keir Starmer saying to whoever, Sky, you can't carry ITV anymore because they're saying shit I don't like.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. Go on,
there's a lot of this, sort of sending signals out, I think, for corporate reputation reasons going on at the moment that are along the same lines. It's interesting. I was on a call with Deutsche Telekom earlier, its earnings announcement today, when the company boss, Timotheus Hertges, was talking about some of the initiatives they've got around, fair treatment and hate speech and things like that, which is a term I really don't like because, I think we talked about this.
Because it's completely subjective and ill-defined.
It's a very subjective term, but it's almost like some of these companies feel a bit, they're cowed by the current sort of political tones, I guess, that are coming out of the US, and they feel they have to sort of show willing. And it was interesting. I've never heard Hertges sort of mention it in an earnings update before, but to hear him talking about what they're doing on things like hate speech, I think they might have had some video they filmed actually with Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama chatting together, and the Deutsche Telekom sort of sponsored it, and it's all about sort of equality in the US and hate speech and sort of fighting that. But
I know someone should write a book.
Very strange, really. They have to sort of feel that they have to sort of mention it on an earnings update, and
it's become endemic. Companies are so worried about social media and the lack of control they have over reputational damage.
Yeah.
All it takes is one person or one small group of people to start going boo hiss, you did a bad thing. And they just completely panic. There will come a stage one day where a large corporate just goes, you know what, fuck off. We haven't done anything wrong. You're being a prick. I don't give a shit what you say on Twitter. But I don't think we're anywhere near that time right now.
No.
And they're all very cowed.
They're all scared, yeah.
I suppose just to finish that segment off, my headline, I talked about the FCC. We've discussed loads of times how the FCC, which is the American telecoms regulator, is politicized in a way that Ofcom isn't, because it has these 5 commissioners. It has the chairperson and 4 commissioners. And it's always the case that two of the commissioners are affiliated to one political party. 2 of the commissioners are affiliated to the other political party, and the chairperson is always affiliated with the party that's in power. So we had Ajit Pai and 2 other Republicans during the Trump time, and now we've got 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and they're still picking a 5th one because one of them got kicked out by Trump. And anyway, the 2 Republican ones, which is Carr and Symington, I think, both came out and about this call for censorship and just called bullshit on it. And then Rosenworcel and I forget the other Democrat one, just haven't said shit.
Right.
Now, I think to me that means that I think they also think this is really dodgy, but tribal affiliation compels them to not condemn it.
Yeah.
I think if they're in favour of it, they probably would have said so.
And she's the Rosenworcel is the acting chair.
Yeah, she's the actual chairperson. Yeah. Although I can't remember who I was chatting to, but someone was telling me, oh yeah, I can remember who it was, but it was just chatting, so I'm not going to name them. That you want to look. She probably won't be made permanent chairperson because she hasn't been sufficiently actively involved in fundraising for Biden, and quite often this is how pathetically corrupt US politics is, quite often the person who gets in charge of the FCC is rewarded for being a very prolific fundraiser for the president. So we're more likely to see someone brought up who just happens to have raised loads of money. This person I was chatting to was certainly suggesting that people like Wheeler and, was it Janikowski or something like that before them, were both pretty active fundraisers. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. I'm not saying this is a fact. This is just gossip from someone who will remain unnamed. But it's an interesting theory, isn't it?
Yep, yeah.
And when you can look at how partisan everything else is, it's not impossible to do. Anyway, I can't imagine that this call by these two Congress people is going to get anywhere. But if it did, the precedent set of calling upon service providers to censor media, I think, is absolutely chilling. And to use an overused term, Orwellian.
Yeah. I hope it doesn't sort of have any traction here in Europe. Seeing that sort of stuff going on.
Yeah, well,
I mean often things that come out of the US do sort of start a reaction, don't they, in Europe? And we see the same.
Because if nothing else, they sort of culturally legitimize it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like, I won't get into it now. I think we spoke about it last week, but the stuff the precedent that's being set with Facebook and Google regarding them compensating the media for lost revenues. The precedent being set in Australia could easily carry over to other parts of the world because people go, oh, well, that's made it all right. So, yeah, I hope the Americans squash it, and I hope the Europeans don't get funny ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time. We want to talk about patents. We've spoken about it once or twice before. In other words, we get a sort of degree of one-upmanship between different telecoms sort of stakeholders about how many patents they own in a given standard and what this means about how great they are. But you've had a little think about those claims and what they really mean.
Yeah, I mean, I've written on the same theme before, I think. So I think the piece I wrote this week didn't say anything radically new, but I thought it was prompted really by a release that Nokia put out recently. They're obviously quite keen to do a bit of chest thumping and show that they still count in 5G after all the problems that they've been having, which we talked about earlier. And patents are really important because they basically show that you're at the forefront of innovation, don't they?
Yeah,
and
certainly shows you've been doing some R&D.
They show that you've been doing R&D, so they kind of show what share of the standard that you have in a way, and I think that's important for all sorts of reasons. There's money in it, they make money on royalties basically, and that could become a much bigger deal in the future if 5G starts to go into all sorts of other objects. There's already sort of disputes going on, I think, with car makers and Nokia about licensing payments. It means that when litigation happens, you're not as exposed to, big sort of legal fees and penalty payments and that kind of thing if you can prove that you've got a strong patent position, which is important because of stuff that we see going on at the moment.
You quite often get trading off, like someone tries to sue you and you go, look, mate, don't start or I'll just sue you back. And they go, yeah,
exactly,
all right, fair enough.
Exactly. And then I guess we talk about bifurcation of standards that might happen and fragmentation with regional standards emerging. So if there's signs that China's been the kind of power, the big power behind 5G, which is what some people have been saying, that they've sort of driven the standard, then it's a bit of a worry, isn't it? That if they do sort of go off and do their own standards, then where's our sort of innovation coming out of European and US companies? Yeah, but I mean it's been. That's I think that's been one of the messages is how much Huawei has and Chinese companies have sort of driven the 5G standard, and there's been a few mainstream press reports I think that have gone out saying it's the biggest company in terms of how many declarations it makes, and it's a real sort of mover and shaker when it comes to the next generation technology. And then Nokia put this statement out based on a report that came out of a company called IP Lytics. I don't know if you know them.
No, I don't.
I mean, they're quite well known in this area. I think it's probably a
see what they've done there, though. They do analytics into intellectual property.
Brilliant, isn't it? And they're pretty well respected. And what they've done is look at, and other companies have been doing this as well. They sort of try to look at overall patents, but also important ones. They sort of did what they call an essentiality ranking. So look at the ones that are really kind of critical to the 5G standard and try and work out what companies' respective positions are there. And they'd ranked Nokia, I think, second. And PA Consulting, which is another consulting firm, had done a study where, again, I think they put them up at first or second. So they'd obviously put out this release. It shows that we're right there at the forefront. We're a real innovator, and I guess on the one hand, it's not a surprise that one of the only big, the three big vendors, one of them is going to have a fairly strong position. But the thing to me is that you look at these reports about who's really driving the standard and who's the biggest company, and they all seem to come out with different. There's no consensus, I mean, there was one that came out from a company called Grey Bee a few months ago, where they'd also looked at declarations and then tried to figure out essentiality, and which ones were important there. And they put Huawei at the top and Nokia down in fourth place. And then another one that
I chatted to people like sort of InterDigital about it in the past. And as you say, there's raw number of patents, but then there's essentiality, and then there's something could be standard as essential, but of a far greater significance within that standard.
Well, this is
another
thing.
Level of.
This is the thing.
Measurement.
I mean, there was one. I think there's a law company called Bird and Bird that did a really interesting study last year where they actually looked at various different. They looked at various different studies, and their starting point was to try and scrutinize some of these stories about Huawei having the sort of leadership position in patents. And one of the tables they put together actually suggested Ericsson was on top, and yet Ericsson's really, really low placed in the IP-lytics one. It's down, I think, in maybe 9th position. It's below companies like InterDigital on the share of standard essential patents it holds, and it's quite low in the Grey Bee one as well. It's 6th there, and yet Bird and Bird put it on top. I mean, my conclusion from all this, and I looked at an interesting blog written by a guy called Richard Windsor, who used to work for Nomura Securities, but now has his own sort of analyst firm, is that you can read. I mean, these ranking studies are not to be trusted. Was my basic conclusion.
That's the long and short of it.
And I think what's happening is that companies that are trying to do the analysis are not. And Bird and Bird have mentioned this. They basically said there's not a lot of consensus clearly on what essentiality is, what it means. And Richard Windsor had used this really interesting analogy of an aeroplane, where he said you've got various things that make the aeroplane do its job. You've got the wings and the engines, and you've also got the seats and the drinks trolleys. Yeah. And they're all actually really important, aren't they?
Because if you're a passenger
plane, if you're a passenger plane, you need the seats, so you need the drinks trolleys. So they're essential, but they're not as essential as the engines and the wings. Yeah?
Being thirsty isn't the same as being dead, is it?
And so the problem then is is how they sort of arrive at this essentiality category. What goes into that, and I think the only thing that you can deduce from looking at very respectable companies. I'm not trying to sort of say that these guys are idiots who don't know what they're doing, but the fact that they're all coming out with very, very different stuff. Some putting Ericsson on top, some putting it down in 9, some putting Huawei on top, some putting Nokia second, is that we don't really know. And the only conclusion you can really draw from this actually is the identity of the companies that do turn up in the rankings, and they all tend to be the same.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing there is it's a relatively small number of companies that are in the mix.
So it's a big kit vendors, InterDigital, Qualcomm.
Qualcomm's in there, of course, and I think a lot of people are wondering why Qualcomm actually perhaps isn't on top.
Because they just don't bother with the base station side.
Well, Richard Windsor also made this interesting point about Huawei turning up top in a lot of the 5G rankings, and another company that does very well actually is Samsung, which I think in the IP-lytics one was actually on the top. And Richard Windsor's issue with that is that a lot of the IP that's in 5G is actually based on the same underlying technologies that 4G used. So there's a sort of coding system called OFDM. I think it's orthogonal frequency division multiplexing or something like that. And that's used in both 4G and 5G. So it'd be very odd for companies like Huawei and Samsung, which didn't have a really strong position in 4G, to suddenly leapfrog other companies.
I seem to remember it's coming back to me. That was an argument like when we chatted about it a few months ago.
Yeah, it's suddenly
where they suddenly come from.
Yeah. Exactly, and I mean, I just think we have to be quite skeptical of any of these studies. But one of the interesting things to me is you look at the companies that are there. They're all the same. They can agree on that. They can at least agree on the mix of companies, and there's hardly any service providers there. which maybe you might think to yourself, well, that's not a surprise because they're not the ones that have been driving the technology. That's what they pay the vendors for. But there's a lot of talk at the moment, isn't there, about how they need to get more involved. I mean, Orange, I think, recently was making a big deal about its patents and how it wants to put more money into this area. Vodafone's been talking about generating its own intellectual property. And yet the only company that showed up in any of these rankings that I looked at that is a service provider is NTT Docomo, the big Japanese player.
Right.
There wasn't a single other operator mentioned. And it just sort of shows, that there's all this worry about the sort of power imbalance at the moment between vendors and operators, and about, operators are kind of keen to try and drive their own destiny a little bit more. If they look at these rankings, they're not going to find a lot of solace there. No.
Well, maybe if operators weren't getting ripped off in auctions so much, they might have a few more quid to spend on it.
Yeah.
But that's always the only. Actually, this is a bit of a tangent, and we better finish off this unless you've got anything else to say on patents. No. You always get this argument, don't you, about operators saying, if you didn't charge us so much for spectrum, or if you let us do M&A, I think yet again I've been seeing stuff written in the press, people lobbying. Maybe it was DT on that call actually, saying how just let us do more M&A, you bastards, because then
they always say that.
Yeah, exactly.
Any of the big incumbents that get on a call with an earnings call always get asked about consolidation, of course, because that's what the business press likes to write about. And they always go, "Oh, Europe needs to be more friendly towards consolidation," and they don't support it. And look at China; they've got 3 big operators, and look at the US; they've got 3 big ones, and we've got 120, and we can't get things going because there's too much competition.
Right. We hear all that stuff, and we hear it from, and they get supported by people like Ekholm. I remember. Oh my God, his name's gone. Swedish analyst we used to talk to all the time got bought by Accenture.
Bengt Nordstrom.
Bengt, that's it. Sorry, Bengt. Your name just completely slipped my mind. Bengt always used to talk in favour of that, and and that's all fine. I don't disagree with it, but what I have slight suspicion about is when they all go about, if you let us create inefficiencies, if you didn't charge us so much for spectrum, we'd have all this money to spend on R&D. Would they though, or would they just give it to shareholders?
Yeah.
As it is, the Vodafone dividend is one of the better dividends you can get out there.
Well, it'd be interesting to look at the US actually on this, because they're a market where they don't have this situation, do they? They've got 3 big players now. They've got 350 million people or whatever it is. They've got the conditions that the European companies are talking about. What's their track record on putting money into innovation and using this? Is it good at the moment? We've just been talking about that spectrum auction. They're pretty heavily indebted as well. Their balance sheets.
For anything doing less. AT&T used to make a lot more noise about its R&D than it does now. So I just think it doesn't necessarily follow. Yes, free up the cash, but the corporate world doesn't necessarily have a great track record of, if you give them some cash, them spending it on the stuff they promise they're going to.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's it. Actually, one last thing before we finish, I've got to point out, you moved to a different location in your living room.
Yeah.
And you've got this excellent bit of artwork behind you, done by your missus, I gather, yeah?
Yeah,
so that's all good. It's not immediately obvious, Magda, what it is, but no offence, it's probably quite abstract. But what I think is most noteworthy about it is it's made of champagne corks, isn't it?
Yeah, that was my contribution, as we talked earlier. I came in and helped out with the.
She was just going to draw. She was just going to get some watercolours out, and you went, no, make it out of champagne corks. Leave it with me, love.
She's got another one coming.
You with the raw materials.
She's got another one coming out soon, made of beer cans.
Yeah, another one made out of buckets of KFC. Anyway, that's quite funny. All right, we better stop there. Give Pierre a chance to sort his life out. So thank you very much once more for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.